Most of the land of Mordor was a barren wasteland, and very little life could grow in this hellish landscape. Yet somehow, Sauron was able to maintain tens of thousands of men and orcs in this land, and each one of these would need ample food and water. Hello friends, it's Carl here, and in today's episode, we'll be exploring the methods that Saruman and Sauron used to feed their armies. So we'll be starting off with the land of Mordor. So even though a large portion of this land was a barren desert, the southern lands of Mordor that surrounded the Sea of Nurnen were actually quite fertile, and they were free from the foul fumes of Mount Doom. This volcano would have enriched its soils with minerals, and Sauron used this land to set up vast fields, and he forced slaves to work and toil in them. This was probably the main food source for his armies, though we must also keep in mind that the faction of Mordor wasn't only restricted to Sauron's realm, but it was a vast empire that stretched to the southern and eastern lands, and these lands were inhabited by men that worshipped and served Sauron. They would offer tribute to Mordor, and they sent many long wagon trains filled with food and supplies, and even slaves, to replenish those that died in Nurnen. Now it seems that the food and supplies of Mordor weren't divided equally, and the men that served Sauron were treated better than the orcs, most probably because they had a lower threshold of what they would tolerate. The orcs would have to make do with foul meats and foul waters, and they had some sort of potent yet horrible tasting drink that reinvigorated their spirit. The fortresses that were scattered across the land, such as Durtang or Ciritungol, had their own stores of food and water to supply their garrisons. And since the northern lands of Mordor were barren, the orcs had built cisterns on their road, which were filled with water, so that their armies would find something to drink as they marched across this land. It's also worth mentioning that rain would sometimes fall upon the mountains that surrounded Mordor, and it would collect in small pools throughout the lands, or form streams to the Sea of Nurnen, and this water was drinkable, even though it had an oily and bitter taste. I also think that it's very likely that while Sauron's armies were mobilized outside of his lands, they would have to plunder and loot nearby villages or homesteads of Gondor for food, and this would offer a new food source for his armies, for they could feast upon their fallen enemies. Now Isengard was once a very fertile land, thanks to the river Isen which flowed through it, and it's possible that Saruman had made the most of it by growing his own food and storing it, before he industrialized his land and began to breed his armies. One of the hurdles that Saruman would face was that his land was much smaller than Mordor to grow food upon, and he lacked allies nearby with whom he could trade and acquire food for his armies. The Dunlendings were technically in his service, and they could probably provide him with food, though Saruman also took advantage of far-off neutral lands such as the Shire, and he bought and traded goods with them such as wine, beer, salted pork, bread and butter. These supplies were of the highest quality, and they were reserved for his favored and most trusted servants who were of the race of men, while the Uruk-Hai would have to make do with much poorer supplies such as raw dried up meats and stale bread. Just like the orcs of Mordor, the Uruk-Hai also had some special drink that tasted horrible and numbed pain, though its effects would only last for a short while before they wore off. It's interesting to note that according to the Uruk-Hai, Saruman fed them man-flesh, though it's possible that this was simply a bluff to impress the other orcs. Even so, it's likely that after their skirmishes and battles, the Uruk-Hai would feast upon the men and horses that they slew in Rohan, and they pillaged and looted these lands. Now most of the valley outside of Isengard had become a wilderness, filled with weeds and thorns, though Saruman still had some acres of land that were plowed by slaves, which he could make use of. Since they were found outside of the walls of Isengard, and since the vast majority of Isengard's food came from other lands, this fortress would suffer in a drawn-out siege because it couldn't produce its own food, while Mordor would be able to sustain itself in such a situation. I also imagine that the slaves of these lands were treated poorly and seen as a resource, one that served the purpose for a time, though which could easily be replaced. And so if I had to speculate, I'd say that the slaves that died from overworking were probably fed to the orcs and their armies, or to the wargs that were kept in their dens. Before ending this video, I'd like to mention that orcs would sometimes resort to cannibalism, and they would eat orc flesh if necessary, though this was seen as a very inferior meat, and they would actually use it to insult each other, by implying or stating that their fellow orcs fed upon it. Anyway friends, this wraps up today's video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this topic. Can you think of any other ways in which Sauron and Saruman might have fed their armies? And can you come up with any new methods which would improve their plans and strategy? As always, I'd like to thank my patrons who have really helped to elevate this channel. It wouldn't be the same without you. And I would like to express how grateful I am for your support, especially our Wizard-Tier Patrons, T-Gorman, Mike Feeney, Roland Myrvold, and Jacob Williams. If you too would like to help support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description below. I'll also be leaving links to our Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and Twitter communities, so follow us if you'd like to have some extra Lord of the Rings content in your day-to-day lives. As always, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.